in Concord, Massachusetts, the site where the shot heard round the world was fired. Everything that matters in the history of the American Revolution passes through this point. Everything built up from the tension back to the Boston Massacre in 1770, through to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and out to the framing of the U.S. Constitution. All of it passes through and hinges on this moment. Welcome to my 4-part series on the Men of Freedom, where I introduce you to the 4 men that you don't hear much about, 4 men who represent the thousands of men like them who were willing to sign up, risking and in some cases losing their lives in the cause of liberty. Relatively unknown, these men, they're not the John Hancocks, the Paul Reveres, or the George Washingtons. They're just regular men that I want to learn from and even emulate in my day-to-day life. Hello, I'm James McQuivey, and welcome to the 4th of July weekend, a perfect day for me to add to my series on men of freedom and on men generally. I've embarked on a year-long project to explore what it means to be a man. A contentious topic these days, it seems, but one that in my opinion doesn't have to be. Rather than listen to the complaints about what men supposedly are, or somebody else's definition of what men should be, I let men speak for themselves. In the nationally representative survey I conducted to understand American men, as well as in the life stories of men who embody the best of what men can be. Men like Isaac Davis. Isaac Davis is the 3rd man in my Men of Freedom series, and definitely the most well-known. So well-known that he has a statue that if you've come to observe these important historic sites, you've seen Isaac standing here since 1875. Or a representation of what he stands for. This sculpture was sculpted by Daniel Chester French, the same man who sculpted the Lincoln Memorial statue in Washington, D.C. Now, this statue was put here on the 100th anniversary of the events that transpired here. And French was invited to sculpt a generic Minuteman to commemorate the 400-plus men who stood on this spot the morning of April 19, 1775. As well as the additional thousands who would join the colonial forces throughout the day in pursuit of the retreating British regular soldiers. Now, French was reportedly so taken by the story of Isaac Davis that he actually intended to model this sculpture on Davis's features. Now, but this is before photography, so according to the national parks, they attempted to find family members where he could look at their facial features and discern some kind of family resemblance and model this after him. Now, depending on what source you read, he successfully did that. It's the position of the National Park Service which administers this space that he didn't actually accomplish that the facial features of the people and the family were so different he was unable to do that. He did, however, include in the statue an exact replica of Isaac Davis's plow. So Isaac Davis makes it in here, even if we can't be sure that his facial features are represented in the statue. So let me back up and review where we've come so far. We started this series talking about the events that led up to that fateful day. We began with the Boston Massacre in 1770 and went right up to the evening of April 18, 1775, the night that Paul Revere and his co-conspirators snuck out of Boston to warn the towns of Lexington and Concord that the British regular army was sending nearly 1,000 troops on a march out to Concord in search of munitions, powder, cannon, most of which had already been secreted away. In the next video, we learned about Dr. Samuel Prescott, the first of my 4 men of freedom, and how his serendipitous encounter with Paul Revere and William Dawes around 1 a.m. on the morning of April 19th put him in a crucial position to warn Concord after Revere and Dawes were captured or had to flee for safety. As I said then, Prescott went on to Concord and initiated a chain of alarms that reached the surrounding area, including neighboring Acton, where a militia captain named Isaac Davis would heed the call. In the next video, I introduce you to Jonathan Harrington, one of 5 men of Lexington who lost their lives in the Battle of Lexington, which wasn't really a battle at all. Instead, it was a confusing volley of shots and a ragged bayonet charge initiated without orders by tired, skittish British soldiers who overreacted to the defiant stand of the Lexington militia at 5 a.m. that morning, leaving 5 men dead and twice as many wounded. After this tragic but minor incident, those soldiers merely reformed their lines and continued on their march to Concord, a 7-mile march, which they did in about 4 hours. That's where today's story starts. By 9 a.m., the soldiers are preparing to enter Concord in search of munitions. By this point, however, local militia and Minutemen groups have been assembling from the surrounding area by the hundreds, including the Acton Minutemen, captained by a 30-year-old Isaac Davis. Davis is the one man in my series that we actually know a lot about, though, as with our other men, a lot of lore has been added to the facts that are verifiable. What we know is that he and his young wife, Hannah Brown Davis, had been married for 9 years by 1775 and had 4 children together. As the events running up to the Revolutionary War accumulated, including especially the powder alarms that I've spoken about before, the town of Acton responded to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress late 1774 suggestion that each town establish a company of Minutemen. Now, Minutemen companies were different than militia companies. In Lexington, they had a standing militia that had existed for over 100 years. Acton did not, and so Acton had to form a company of Minutemen. Now, Minutemen were called Minutemen because they were going to train and be prepared to be available at any minute, but did not have regular formal duties that a militiaman might. Now, those details to one side, when Acton decided in November of 1774 to form a company of Minutemen, Davis was elected as captain. And one good reason for this, beside his solid character, was his trade. Davis was a gunsmith, and he understood that the muskets that local colonials used for hunting were not as effective in battle because they had to be reloaded using a powder horn. You can see in the statue the representation of the powder horn. That's literally an ox horn that's been hollowed out and prepared to store powder so that you could actually pour the powder in from the large mouth side and then use the funnel at the end to direct powder into the actual musket itself. Loading gunpowder from a powder horn like that is a time-consuming and error-prone process. Now, if you're just hunting with your musket, as most of these people were most of the time, that's going to work just fine. But Davis, as a gunsmith, knew that that put them at a huge disadvantage to the British, because taking that extra time and having that extra source of error is going to put them up against really the world's finest army, where, well, as I'll give you an example here shortly, the British would commonly drill their soldiers on how to load their muskets every day. The statue of Davis that I'm looking at right now, technically not him, but modeled after him, is a little bit incorrect in this particular case. I guess it's correct in that it represents most Minutemen who would have used powder horns. Davis did not, and neither did any in his company, because they used instead cartridges. Now, I'm going to do a deep dive video on these weapons later on because I think it's fascinating, but understand that a cartridge refers to a small piece of heavy paper that has been rolled into a small tube and then tied such that there are 2 compartments, one for powder and one for the ball. The process of preparing a weapon for firing is the same with the powder horn as it is with the cartridge. It's just that the cartridges were in a box worn at the hip. Super easy to retrieve one by one, and then the powder, of course, is pre-measured, and once poured, the ball could be stuffed down the barrel with the rest of the paper around it. And this actually helps keep the ball in place. There's almost nothing worse than preparing to have your musket fire ready, and then all of a sudden the ball rolls out of your piece because it didn't get packed in well enough. So the paper actually helped prevent that. Now, on that fateful morning, Davis received word of the British movements before dawn via messengers from Concord to Acton, who had largely been informed of the situation by Dr. Samuel Prescott. Now, this would be roughly 4:30 in the morning, roughly the same time that the events of Lexington were just about to occur. So at this point, they know nothing of the 5 men who would soon lay dead or dying in Lexington. As the word spread, Davis called the Acton Minutemen to gather at his home. So it would be around 5 o'clock. They spent a couple of hours making more paper cartridges, and some of them actually flowered their hair so that they would look like gentlemen to the British. Now, we have reliable accounts from Davis's wife, Hannah, about the events of that morning, about who gathered and when they gathered and what they did there. Now, she reported that amid all of the bustle, he seemed very somber, and he spoke very little. At one point, the men actually joked about later that day being fired upon by British regulars, and Davis apparently called them on their light treatment of the topic, given that it was very likely that some of them would soon be killed. By 7 a.m., Davis ordered his company to march toward Concord, and according to multiple accounts, including Hannah's, shortly after they began their march, Davis ordered his company to halt. He returned to his front door and said to his wife, "Take good care of the children." These would be his last words to his wife of nearly 10 years. Well, the details of the Battle of Concord are many, and I won't try to capture them all here. But Davis marched his company the 6-mile route today known as Isaac Davis Trail toward Concord. And as they entered the borders of the town, they passed the farm of Colonel James Barrett, who was the highest level commander of provincial or colonial troops that morning. Barrett's farm, just a little ways down the road here, had been a hiding place for munitions. So there was a detachment of British regulars there searching the farm, and this caused Davis at first to consider attacking them mid-search, which would have been a reckless action, unprovoked and without orders. But Davis ultimately acceded to orders to march further on to the Old North Bridge along the Concord River. This is a recreation of that Old North Bridge, of course back then only called North Bridge, even though honestly the bridge itself, or some version of it, had been existing here for more than 120 years. So they could have called it Old North Bridge back then and it would have been a fair title. Davis and his men reached the area of the bridge by 9 a.m. So there were about 400 men present, including his men, all of them from neighboring communities, including Concord itself, neighboring Lincoln and Bedford. They were largely up on the hill over here, overlooking the bridge. And I'll give you some sense of that hill. The top of that hill is a home that stands today, Major John Buttrick's home. We're going to hear his name in just a moment. But this area largely becomes a space for the men to observe what's happening and make plans about what they should do next. While these men were gathering up on the hill back here, the British regulars that had come here to secure the bridge while their compatriots went to surrounding farms looking for munitions, well, they got a little concerned. There's about 100 of them, so they're already outnumbered, significantly really. And they went to the other side of the bridge to maintain their occupation of the bridge, but from a much safer vantage point. Hold the bridge from across the water. Now, by now, word had already arrived about what transpired in Lexington, though the rumors were unreliable. But enough was known about the Redcoats' aggression at Lexington that Colonel Barrett was consulting his lieutenants and others on a possible attack on the regulars holding the bridge. Given their superior numbers, Barrett and others determined that such an attack had a high probability of success, despite the unevenness in the training of the two groups. 400 to 100, these are good odds. But also factor in the exhaustion the Redcoats had to be feeling at this moment. It must have been very disconcerting to be them. And remember, I said that British soldiers trained on musket fire daily, but the Boston regiments did not actually have enough powder and ball to spare to allow that level of training. So given that their barracks were also riddled with lice, their food supplies were dwindling, these soldiers were tired, they're less well trained, they're weak, and few of them had actually seen actual combat. If ever there was a time to attack British regulars when they were down, this was it. Now, whether Barrett knew all of that or not, he made the determination to line his men to prepare for a possible attack across the bridge. It was at this moment that a fateful error was made by other British soldiers not even present. Further down the river, where a larger body of British soldiers had been searching the town center of Concord, they encountered wooden gun carriages. These are carts, essentially, that are designed to transport cannon. The cannon themselves had been absconded long before, but the carts were there, and the British determined to hamper the provincials by burning their wooden carts. Now, from the North Bridge here, the smoke that arose over the trees to the south, well, it made it look like the British had determined to burn down the town. At this point in history, Concord is a gem. Some families have lived here for over a century, multiple generations. Burning their town would be a complete provocation and clear justification for an attack on these awful soldiers who had killed other provincials in Lexington just hours earlier. Unfortunately, it wasn't true. But the colonials here, they had no way of knowing this. And Barrett, in council with his fellow officers, decided to attack the bridge. Now here's where small decisions have large consequences. Davis's company was originally assigned to take up position on the rear of the advancing line. The men in front were actually commanded by David Brown of Concord. But when asked, Brown admitted to Barrett, the colonel in charge, that his men were not nearly as prepared as Davis's men were. They lacked cartridges and bayonets. So Barrett asked Davis if his company would lead the advance. His response was unequivocal. As recorded here on a plaque that was installed 200 years after the event itself, Captain Davis said, "I haven't a man who is afraid to go." Unlike so many other claims and quotes about what really happened that day, this one is confirmed by independent sources who were present. Davis really was the man that history has made of him. His response and the courage of his Minuteman Company put them at the newly formed head of the column, with Major John Buttrick of Concord beside him as they led their columns two abreast toward the bridge. Even British soldiers who would later reflect on the event would say that the sight of these men marching toward them with such discipline and precision made them look as professional as any British regular troops could be. Davis was about to sacrifice his life precisely because he was uniquely prepared, uniquely willing, and uniquely disciplined. The statue is placed here with respect to the bridge because it's estimated that this was actually where Davis would lose his life. They're some 75 yards shy of the British on the other side, and it's at this moment that the regulars fired at least one warning shot. Like with so many other events on that day or surrounding the Revolutionary War, there is considerable disagreement on the details of this. How many shots? Where were they directed? Whether anyone was harmed in the firing of the warning shots. All of this is disputed. But the outcome is certain. Warning shots across that bridge turned into a volley aimed directly at the advancing column of Minutemen. At the head of the column, Captain Isaac Davis took a ball to the chest and died immediately. Another man was also killed. Major John Buttrick, whose home sits on that hill, saw Davis fall immediately, and he issued these words, his command: "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire." They did. And when the smoke cleared, 2 British regulars lay dead and another dying. This site marks the place where those 2 British soldiers still lie today. It says, "They came 3,000 miles and died to keep the past upon its throne, unheard beyond the ocean tide. Their English mother made her moan." With a small number of casualties, the British line was cast into complete disarray. They beat a hasty retreat back down the river to Concord to reform with the rest of the British. The Minutemen did not pursue them. They instead regrouped here, went back across the water to figure out what to do next. In fact, it was hours before the British would fully regroup in Concord and, without being harassed or harangued at all, would begin their march back to Boston. But key to the events of what happens later in the day is that those hours of deliberation and consideration allowed many, many more of the colonial militiamen from the surrounding areas to come. First hundreds and then thousands. And these individuals were the ones who would harry, to use the battle term, the distressed British soldiers all the way back to Boston. Now I've crossed back over to this side of the bridge. The bridge, I think, works as a metaphor for what happened here. Of course, America crossed a crucial bridge in that moment, eventually becoming the country that we live in today. But I also feel like even though Isaac Davis himself wasn't able to physically move across that bridge that day or ever again, he demonstrates a bridge that we should consider crossing as we raise young men to be men. Because Davis is the model. Davis is the model because he did exactly what I have shown in my other videos and in my survey data that masculine men do regularly. Davis signed up to do 4 specific things. First, he developed skills that could be useful to others. He was in the position he was because he was a gunsmith, a knowledgeable gunsmith. Those skills were useful to his community, which lets you do, in combination with number 2, you earn the trust of the people around you. He was elected to be the captain. This was an elected position. And then that allows him to do number 3, which is you respond to the call to serve. You're elected, you sign up. You not only show up, but you work hard to do it as best as you can. Teach your people. He had an improvised shooting range in his backyard where he trained the men not only on how to fire to get greater accuracy, but also to teach them how to quickly swap out their cartridges and load their muskets. And then number 4, masculine men, like Isaac Davis, are willing to take risks and ultimately sacrifice to accomplish good things. So clearly the case. His sacrifice required his life in a way that Dr. Samuel Prescott did not, but Jonathan Harrington did as well. In the process of doing these 4 things, it's not just what he did here that day, it's how he prepared to be ready to do that. Called upon by the colonel leading the entire area, are your men able to go to the front of the line? And his answer was, I haven't a man who's afraid to. I love that. In the process, he created the conditions for one of the most famous lines of poetry ever written about American history, penned by Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1836, so about 60 years later. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Now today, people rather ambiguously refer to the shot heard round the world as something that could have happened kind of anywhere along the way, from the span of the Boston Massacre to the Battle of Lexington. But Emerson was wise to coin the phrase with reference specifically to what happened at Concord, because it was the shot fired under orders of Major John Buttrick when he said, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire," that history was forever altered. This was the first incident in what we later called the Revolutionary War, where anyone fired on anyone from either side under orders. That's the reason why that shot is the one heard around the world. It initiated treasonous declaration of war. And he issued that command because he stood next to the freshly fallen body of Isaac Davis. So yes, we know more about Davis than we know about any of the other men I call the men of freedom. But I want to propose that we think of this not as accolades for a single man, but accolades for a type of man, the exact men we need to cultivate in our homes and in our communities. Men who will make these difficult choices disciplined, self-sacrificing, and courageous. Thank you for joining me. I'm James McQuivey, following in the footsteps of men I aspired to be more like. Stay tuned for the 4th of 4 Men of Freedom, where we learn about the bitter return to Boston down Battle Road for beleaguered and harassed British soldiers. It will be a somber one, because the body count is about to get intense.